Anyway, this is week 2, Stalin's revolution, and going to get into more or less really his revolution at this point. Keep in mind he is in firm control by 1927, having, when he was named General Secretary of the party, and that's there needs to be a little addendum added to that. He's General Secretary of the party, which enabled him to staff many of the different government portfolios in what's going to be the Soviet government with people who are going to be allied to him. And again, I mentioned last week, Saddam Hussein did the same sort of thing. Sure, Hassan Bakir is the president, but guess who's doing all the legwork for Hassan Bakir? Mr. Hussein. And guess what he's doing? So that by 1979, when Hassan Bakir says, I'm going home, and Saddam takes over, well, he's already staffed many of the government portfolios with people who are allied to him, like Mr. Stalin over here. And that's not hard to figure out because Joseph Stalin was one of Saddam's political idols. And so what you see here is a man who's taking control of this government, and he's going to stop that new economic program that Lenin had to save the Bolshevik movement after the Civil War by allowing the peasants to grow their not only grow their crops, but sell some of their crops on the market and make money. I mean, the Soviet economy was going into the tank, literally at this point, which is one reason why, and there's a good place to start. Italy, 1922. Keep in mind the Versailles Treaty, already been signed, and the Germans are paying reparations to the British, the French, the Belgians. $33 billion. That's a lot of money back then when you have a broken economy. The Germans are responsible for reparations to the West, plus the Belgian war debt. And that gets America into this, but I'm not going to go there. But at this point, there was a provision, and I think it's number 116, I think. There is a provision in Versailles that would allow the Russians, even at a future date, to claim reparations. And so when Lenin, and keep in mind here, what's going to be the Soviet Union has been ostracized from European politics. They are not recognized politically. Well, really, neither is the Weimar Republic. And Lenin understands this, being astute politically. He contacts the British and the French. Gee, let's have a meet. And and we want to collect our reparations. The British are thinking, British and French, gee, this is great. And when the Germans pay back the Russians can pay us back for Tsarist debts. And so what did Lenin do? Well, he put out that line, he's going to reel them in. And when he gets to Italy, Chicherin, the foreign minister Chicherin, contacts Walter Rathenau and tells Rathenau, we don't want reparations. Well, what do you want? How about political recognition? And Rathenau, who at this point believed that Germany's future was with the West, not the East, this constant position of being ostracized by the West, all right. And so Lenin's not stupid. He knows if he's going to be recognized even by the Germans, what are the British and French eventually going to do? Political recognition of the Soviet Union. And so Lenin pulled off the neatest diplomatic trick of the year, 1922, April 1922. And so does this help the Russians? Politically, yes. Politically, yes. But that same year, 1922, Stalin is named General Secretary of the party. And the addendum to this is when Khrushchev took power, he wasn't named General Secretary. He was named First Secretary. Terminology here? I don't think I think the Russians learned. They weren't going to make that mistake again. Has anyone really had the power in Russia since Stalin? There's a discussion for you. But having said that, Stalin, is going to stop this NEP stuff, this new economic program, which was criticized to a certain extent by Trotsky. It's capitalistic. Yeah, it is, but if you want to stay in power, you better throw some bones to the people or else you're out. We'll have a counter-revolution. Lenin didn't want that. He was astute enough to figure that out. But what is Stalin going to do? He understands this proletarian revolution stuff. Yeah, they're in power. But if you're going to take your place on the world stage as a power, how are you going to do that with this proletarian revolution stuff? Really? You know, Stalin understands, too, that the Versailles Treaty is the biggest fraud ever perpetrated on modern man. There's another war coming. He understands this one. And he also understands that in 1914, when the Tsar went to war with the Germans, and they began to mobilize here, that, again, and I mentioned this in previous talks, Stalin understood that Tsarist Russia was the least organized, least industrialized, least prepared for war. 90% of the people are peasants. How many of them are factory workers? None. They're in the fields. You know, and Stalin understands too. You mobilize 6 million men, 4 million have rifles. How's that going to work? And yeah, badly is right. And some of these guys only 4, 5, 6 rounds of ammunition. That's not happening in Germany. How about France or Britain? They're industrialized. And so Stalin is going to start a program of forced industrialization of the Soviet Union. First stop is, let's collectivize the peasant. We're going to take control of the peasantry. This means the collection squads are going to have to go out and pinch a certain amount of grain and livestock. This is what was done during the Civil War. And not all the peasants were on board with this. This is what the Confederacy was doing. The Richmond government. This is what they were doing. You had to feed an army, didn't you? You know, an army is part of what an army is what it can eat, right? You know, you can and what is an army? It's a mass of consumers. They producing anything? No, they're not. Can they really be a drain on an economy? Yeah, sure can. Sure can, but you got to feed them. And this is what they were doing during the Confederate years. You know, the Richmond government used to send out their collection squads, take a certain percentage of the grain and the livestock to feed the army. You think all these small farmers were on board with this? Well, you can't collect taxes from them. How much are you going to buy with the Confederate currency? And so you send out the collection squads. Well, that's what Stalin's going to do. Stalin's plan here is, I'm going to feed this. Keep in mind, the big program here was urbanization. Let's get people out of the countryside and into the cities. Got to modernize. Got to modernize. And part of this is the factory system. Factory system. Now, he's going to get a backlash here, but from what is considered in the Soviet Union, the right of the party. And who was considered to the right of the party, according to Stalin here, is people like Nikolai Uglanov, who was in charge of the Moscow party machine. Mikhail Tomsky, who was on the General Council of Trade and was also on the Pravda editorial board. People like this. Nikolai Bukharin, who at one point was a party theorist and also was at Pravda, but he was at one point in the Stalinist camp. Is considered no longer in the Stalinist camp. And yet he was one of the, you want to use founders of the Bolshevik movement with Lenin, came up with Lenin, just like Grigory Zinoviev, who has really been reduced as a personality here by this point. Talking 1928, 29. You see what Stalin's doing here? The party is gravitating toward him. He's putting his stamp on it. And so he's eventually going to put out of power these people to pave the way to get his program done, the forced industrialization of the Soviet Union. And younger people are coming up here. This is what a leader like Stalin usually does anyway. Purges the people he came up with, perhaps, and brings up new people allied with the program. Somebody like a Vyacheslav Molotov, remember him? Yeah, Lazar Kaganovich, some people like this. But Stalin wants to industrialize the Soviet Union. Now, how's he going to go about doing that? He's going to bring in engineers from the United States, Britain, and France. Maybe teach people in the Soviet Union how to be bona fide engineers. He's going to concentrate on heavy industry, machine tools, tractors. Keep in mind here that as this progression of collectivization goes on here, many of these peasants do not want to have their grain and their livestock confiscated. In fact, some of them kill the livestock. Well, if they're killing the livestock, how are they going to plow the fields? So what's Stalin's idea? Well, why don't we use tractors instead of horses and mules? This is the era where gasoline and oil's taken off. What was gasoline and oil doing here in the 1920s? It builds suburbia here. Cheap gas, cheap oil. Now you can move out of the cities and move into Darien, Norwalk, God knows where. The car, gasoline, cheap oil. Well, Stalin sees this. He's not stupid. And he knows, and Russia's awash in oil. One of the reasons Hitler's going to want it, I'll get into that next week. And so the idea here, tractors. That's heavy industry. Why should the peasant not be using tractors? You can produce more food and reap more crops with a tractor or tractors. But then again, what can you convert tractor factories into when a time of war? That's the stuff, tanks. That's what Stalin sees. Now keep in mind, how else is he going to get this program started? How about creating that aura of fear? Does that ring a bell lately? It should. Half your 2016 presidential election was based on the element of fear. And so what do you see here? Stalin, he's going to use what's going on outside the Soviet Union to create this aura of fear. For example, 1926, British authorities cracked down on Arco in England. This was supposed to be a Soviet trade mission. Well, what were they doing? The British accused them of spying. They cracked down on this. Stalin uses this idea that the Kuomintang, Stalin urged the Kuomintang and the communists in China to get together. Why? Because Stalin was afraid of Japanese appetites. He doesn't want the Japanese to invade Siberia. Well, what's one way to keep the Japanese from invading Siberia? Gee, let's try to foster a relationship here between the Kuomintang and the communists. We know where that went. That didn't work. That didn't work. And so what you're seeing here is Stalin using events overseas. Another one. A Soviet plenipotentiary in Poland was assassinated. 1927, 1928. So Stalin is fostering this aura that the world, the capitalist world, is closing in on our socialist revolution. We need to band together. How do we do this? Industrialize the Soviet Union. And he's going to crack down on those who don't agree with the agenda. And so, essentially, what happened in the German Nazi invasion of 1941, the Soviets are already getting into this war mode in 1928, 1930, 1932, and this is only going to get worse. And keep that in mind. When fear is holding a country together, the crackdown gets worse, not better. Because there are certain people who will use the element of fear to maintain their primacy of power. Hitler come to mind here? Hitler come to mind here? Oh, at this point, if you have any questions, try to hold them to the end. Write them down and give them to me at the end. And then I'll just take them in order here. And so this is what Stalin's trying to do here. And to do that, he's got to make sure he keeps the party in line. But at the same time, and that's another thing with the peasants. What's going to happen to these peasants between 1927 and 1933? Sure, I've seen some propaganda footage. It's interesting to see. this idea of urbanization of the Soviet Union, these nice propaganda photos of people, a husband and wife or a guy and a gal out in a restaurant, having a nice dinner, people driving a car. And yet, when you can see them, you see what's happening to the peasants in the countryside with the distended bellies, starving, dead animals in the fields. It's not a pretty picture. And yet, Stalin is using some of this grain and this livestock to not only feed the cities and the Red Army, exporting same to raise hard currency to pay for more factories. And at the same time, some of these people who have moved off the land to the cities to work in these factories, they're going to be working 10, 12, 15 hours a day, 5, 6 days a week. And some of these people are going to be underpaid for the job they're doing, or the jobs they're doing, and overcharged for the shoddy goods they're going to buy in the stores. And the excess profit, surplus value, as Marxists call this, they'll plow that back into the system to build more factories. Now, this isn't communism. What would you call this? Maybe state capitalism? Yeah, sure it is. Sure it is. And so at the same time Stalin is doing this, he's bringing up people to replace the Bolsheviks who are going to eventually get caught up in this purge. People like, again, Vyacheslav Molotov, Kaganovich. How about Nikita Khrushchev, Alexei Kosygin, Leonid Brezhnev? These are going to be the new. This is going to be the new crop coming up. And at the same time, this aura of fear, you begin to see what's going on here too in Nazi Germany. January 1933. January 19th, Paul von Hindenburg's going to call the one person he really didn't want to call, that vulgar little corporal from Austria. Adolf Hitler will be the new Chancellor of Germany. Who, by the way, didn't really become a German citizen until 1932. Since he knew he had to be a German citizen to be Chancellor. Really. And so he's now the new Chancellor. The businessmen and bankers, the army, right-wing politicians, we are hiring him. Now, how'd that work out in the end? But at this point, Hitler's position is tenuous. But the fact of the matter is, as we go from 1933 into 1934, there is in Germany at this point the problem with the SA, the stormtroopers, Ernst Röhm's stormtroopers. There was, if you want to call it that, a left-wing faction in the Nazi Party, believe it or not. Otto Strasser, Gregor Strasser, Ernst Röhm. The Strasser brothers believed in this, National Socialist German Workers' Party, socialism. Hitler could care less about that. Two words really resonate with Hitler: national and German. Fascism. But at the same time, you have people like the Strasser brothers who really wanted a better deal for the German worker. Or Ernst Röhm, who believed that this SA, which helped bring Hitler to power and helped keep him in power, the beer hall brawlers, should be the nucleus of a new German People's Army. Now, how do you think that went along with these reactionary generals? Some of these Prussian aristocrats, yeah, that's going to go over well. Especially since Ernst Röhm was a notorious homosexual who used to have an officer in the SA bring in boys and men for him. Yeah, that went over well with the Prussian aristocrats, the Junker class. And so Hitler's going to be told. April 1934, the famous Deutschland cruise. And, he's going to be told, businessmen, bankers, the army, right-wing politicians, get rid of Röhm if you want our continued support. And so on the night of June 30 to July 1, 1934, the night of the long knives, and the SA is decapitated. Some estimates range upwards of 1,000 Germans were shot or killed. And it wasn't just SA. This was a time to settle old scores. And so this sees the eclipse of the SA and the rise of the SS, Heinrich Himmler. Now, what does that have to do with the Soviet Union? Now, keep in mind here, Stalin sees this. Yeah, this might work. This might work. Now, keep in mind here, too, that as Hitler consolidates his grip on power, he's also making foreign policy arrangements like, get this one with Poland, 1934. Signs a non-aggression pact with Poland. What's going to happen with that 5 years down the road? But why did he do that? You know, Hitler's not stupid. He can read a map. You know, again, that thing we don't do too well with in this country anymore called geography. He understands where Germany's situated. France, Germany, Poland. Well, let's have a non-aggression pact with the Poles. Maybe we can neutralize Poland politically from the French. That might work. And the Poles might sign on with us because who's to the east of the Poles? The Soviet Union. They're Russians, aren't they? You know, Russians and Poles don't quite get along together. Okay, let's see if we can. And he works it. He gets it done. You know, and this point, Stalin, by the way, well, you know, Maxim Litvinov will be the foreign minister of the Soviet Union. He agrees with fashioning Russia's fortunes with the West to keep fascist Italy and this rising Nazi Germany in place. And so the Soviet Union will be able to join the League of Nations in 1934, this thing known as collective security. But at the same time, Stalin is looking to keep himself in power. There's a man in the Soviet Union, and his name is Sergei Kirov. Sergei Kirov is around 38, 39. He's Russian. He's in charge of the Leningrad Communist Party in the Soviet Union. He gave a brilliant speech at the Soviet Party Congress. He's fairly good looking, is a pretty good orator, and he's Russian. What's Stalin? A Georgian, not a Russian. Kirov is a Russian. And so some seem to think that he is the heir to Stalin. On the last 2 pages of that handout, I called it Discipline by Revolver. On December 1, 1934, a Leonid Vasilyevich Nikolaev walks up to the 3rd floor of the Leningrad Party building. It's what's known as the old Smolny Institute. And Kirov is in his office working. And Nikolaev goes in the office, takes out a pistol, shoots him in the neck, and kills him. And supposedly Stalin goes into a towering rage. Nikolaev will be shot. His wife Mildred Drula will be shot. Kirov's commander of the bodyguard, Comrade Borisov, will be shot. Interesting, who else will be shot here? Ivan Ivanovich Katilinov, Leningrad communist, ex-follower of Grigory Zinoviev. He will be shot. Vladimir Salmanovich Levin, Leningrad communist, ex-Zinoviite, shot. Vladimir Rumentsev, Leningrad communist, ex-Zinoviite, shot. Upwards of 100 people will be shot directly in and around this incident. This will start the Great Purges. You know, Stalin sees what Hitler did with the Night of the Long Knives. He's now going to follow up. And the NKVD will be put to work. And as we go in through the 30s here, especially the latter part of the 30s, the rate of show trials will pick up. Now, the example of the show trials for Stalin occurred in 1927-28 as he's beginning this program of industrialization. In the Shakti province of the Donbass in Ukraine, some engineers in a factory were accused of sabotage and working with foreign powers. This began a spate of show trials disciplining these so-called engineers. And so what Stalin did with this show trial with these engineers, he's now going to use as a full-fledged program of law and order. Now there we are with those two words again. In purging the Bolshevik Party. And as I note on this, you're going to see certain people get shot. Lev Kamenev, an early Bolshevik member, shot in 1936. Alexei Rykov, one of those who at one point was considered part of the rightist opposition to Stalin. At one point a Politburo member, chairman of the People's Commissars, shot in 1938. Leon Trotsky, you know what happened to him in 1940, murdered. Nikolai Bukharin, there's the name Bukharin, former party theorist, murdered and shot in 1938. And so according to Robert Conquest here, who writes in his book, The Great Terror, interesting what he says, arrested, get in mind, arrested in 1937-38, some 7 million arrested. Executed, by his figures, 1 million. Died in the gulags, another 2 million. In prison, 1 million, but in the gulag system, assuming some 5 million were already in the camps at the end of 1936, by the end of 1938, you got upwards of 8 million. Now keep in mind what else is going to happen. That's the party. We haven't even touched the army yet. We haven't touched the army yet. Now it's reputed that the Hitler's SS, through Reinhard Heydrich, remember Hangman Heydrich in command of the SD, the Sicherheitsdienst. The Sicherheitsdienst was, you had the Abwehr, which was military intelligence. The SD is the party's intelligence. Yeah, you had the Gestapo. The Gestapo can be considered something like, if you want to use the generic term FBI, as opposed to the SD, which is the party watchdog, but also did foreign intelligence espionage for the party. Reinhard Heydrich will later be one of those instrumental in trying to form the final solution. He'll be assassinated in Czechoslovakia in May of 1942. Lidice, or Lidice if you want to use that name for the town. In fact, there are several towns in the United States after that, because the Nazis went in there and just destroyed Lidice, wiped it off the map. All men in the village between 16 years old and older were shot. And several cities in this country changed their name during the war to Lidice or Lidice. One was a city in the, if you go through New York and you run into the city Lidice or Lidice, they changed their name, supposedly, to remember this Czechoslovakian village. And so you will see now, that they so-called planted information that implicated Mikhail Tukhachevsky, one of the marshals of the Soviet Union, in conspiring against Stalin. Tukhachevsky is one of the best theorists, military theorists in Russia. Is up on modern ways of having a modern military. The tank, for one thing. But Stalin is reputed to be really paranoid. And so what happens here? You begin to get the crackdown on the military in 1937. 3 of 5 Soviet marshals will be shot. 13 of 15 army commanders. 57 of 85 corps commanders. 110 of 195 division commanders, 220 of 406 brigade commanders. Now we're down to colonels. In addition, all 11 deputy defense political commissars shot. Now, according to Charles D. Winchester, who wrote a pretty good book on Stalin's war in Russia, Hitler's war in Russia, of 80,000 commissioned officers in the Soviet armed forces, 40,000 were purged, 15,000 were shot. According to Brian Fugate, who wrote another pretty good book on Operation Barbarossa, Fugate's book just sticks with the earlier portion of Hitler's invasion. He puts it at 35,000 shot. So the figures are kind of murky, but we know interesting here, because I found a quote here from Voltaire. Voltaire once observed that every so often a general or admiral should be executed as a form of motivation for the rest of the staff. Now, what Stalin is doing is not motivating, this is decapitating. That's what he's doing. And so there are people like Konstantin Rokossovsky, who was a very competent general, very competent officer. Fortunately for him, he'll be purged, but he won't be shot. His father was Polish, his mother was Russian. And the NKVD will pull out his fingernails and toenails and send him to the gulag. He will be rehabilitated. Get this one. He'll be rehabilitated, and during the war, he will be hero of the Soviet Union twice. What a country. You know, it's said, too, that during the Stavka meetings, the high command meetings during the war, Stalin would say, okay, Zhukov, okay, Vatutin, okay, whatever your name is. When supposedly, whenever he got to Rokossovsky, he would go, Konstantin Konstantinovich, what do you think? Guilt feelings? I don't know about that one. Rokossovsky's interesting. He hadn't seen because of political events in Eastern Europe, like with the Russo-Polish War and what happened with the Russian Revolution, he didn't see his sister for almost 30 years. And supposedly at the end of the war, when he finally met his sister again, he was so proud to introduce her to Stalin. And that this is the guy who, virtually this is the guy who had his fingernails and toenails pulled out in 37, 38, and had him consigned to make ice cakes in Siberia. What a country. What a country. At the same time, Stalin again knew that they were going to have another war. But at the same time, he agrees with Maxim Litvinov, collective security with the West. But Stalin's going to take a look at this. Is collective security really working? 1931. Didn't Japan invade Manchuria? What did the League of Nations do? Did they really do anything? Yeah, they sanctioned the Japanese. Recall the newsreel footage when the Japanese delegation got up and left the League of Nations. I don't know how many of you have ever seen that footage. It's interesting footage. It doesn't last long, but it's captured the Japanese getting up and walking out. Keep in mind, though, if you were from a country that was a member of the League of Nations, you just didn't leave. You had to give 2-year notice. Actually, the Japanese were still sending their reports in until they officially left in 1935. And 1935, Italy invades Abyssinia, or Ethiopia, if you want to use that term. The League do anything? Not much. And Mussolini even used poison gas. That's in contravention to the 1925 Geneva Protocol. 1936. 1935, another one here. Again, Stalin paying attention to what's going on here. June 1935, the Anglo-German naval agreement. Now, this is an interesting piece of literature to read. You know, according to the Versailles Treaty, Germany wasn't supposed to have any submarines, for good reason. And yet with this agreement, the Germans can build up to 35% of British naval tonnage, rebuild their navy. They can also build up to 45% of British submarine tonnage. And there's an escape clause to that one. If they give the British 6 months notice, they can build up to 100% of British Navy submarine tonnage. And this is where Dönitz comes in. He's not stupid. He understands many British submarines are 1,000 tons, 1,200, 1,500 tons. He wants submarines that are 500, 600, 700 tons. I can double the amount of submarines and stay within the tonnage. You know, it's interesting what's going on here. 1936, March 7 to be exact. Hitler marches 2 battalions into the Rhineland, that German province on the eastern French border, which is not supposed to be militarized, from 50 kilometers from the French border, according to Versailles. You know, Hitler's generals were like this. The French can mobilize 100 divisions. What are we going to do? And Hitler, pull out? The French don't march. 1936, the Spanish Civil War. 1937, Japan invades China proper. The big war on the war on the Asian mainland is on. A war which in 8 years will claim some estimates 15 million Chinese in 8 years. And then you wonder why the Chinese squawk every time the discussions come up that Japan might have to rebuild their military. Them and the Koreans. There's a good reason for that. 1938, Hitler absorbs Austria into the Rhineland, the Anschluss as it's called. That's against the Versailles Treaty. Austria and Germany are supposed to be together. And then obviously the Sudeten crisis. Fall of 1938. Hitler carves off the Sudetenland and absorbs another 2 or 3 million Germans into the Reich. And what does he say? This is the last territorial demand I have to make. Who's kidding who here? Remember when Neville Chamberlain at Heathrow Airport, when he gets home, waving the peace in our time? Remember that one? You know, how far did that go? Because 6 months later, Hitler is going to dismember the rest of Czechoslovakia. And again, a 20-year experiment coming out of Versailles is wiped off the map. And it's going to be at this point where Stalin is going to say, this collective security isn't working too well. And so he'll can Maxim Litvinov, and he brings in a hardcore Stalinist. Vyacheslav Molotov is the new foreign minister. Now things are going to change. Things are going to change. And the watchword that summer of 1939 was Poland. Churchill and Lloyd George, he's still around by the way, urge Neville Chamberlain, make a deal with the Russians. In other words, trying to resurrect the old British-French Tsarist Russia amalgamation against Germany, Austria, Hungary, and what was going to be the Ottoman Empire. And Neville Chamberlain is slow on the draw here. He doesn't like Stalin. He doesn't like the system. I can understand why. But then again, the Nazis aren't waiting. After all that anti-Soviet propaganda, the so-called hatred of the communists, what were some of the Nazis used to call Soviet Russia? Having a Judeo-Bolshevik government. Hitler writes this, Judeo-Bolshevik, in Mein Kampf. Says this in Mein Kampf. And so you will see here the Germans and the Russians come together. You know, Stalin doesn't want a Poland either. But then again, he doesn't want the Germans to grab it because that'll extend the German border further east, right? Yeah, it will. And so on the night of August 23, 24, 1939, Vyacheslav Molotov in Moscow, Joachim von Ribbentrop, the German foreign minister, who at one point was a champagne salesman. And Molotov signed the 1939 Nazi-Soviet, what's known as the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact. Now, this non-aggression pact kind of is almost like the Treaty of Rapallo in 1922, where you saw the Germans and the Soviets giving each other political recognition. And again, you see here, well, starting in 1922, eventually the Soviets are going to be sending raw materials the Germans need, and then the Germans will be sending finished goods to the Soviet Union that the Soviets need. That's the icing. What's on the cake? Well, if you get into the late 1920s, the Germans, they're not supposed to have submarines, they're not supposed to have tanks, they're not supposed to have combat planes. Yet what are the Germans doing? You know, and the Allied liaison officers don't see this. The Germans are sending soldiers and officers into the bowels of Ukraine to train with the Red Army. And they're training on armored cars, what are going to be tanks and planes. They're not supposed to be doing this. They're training with the Soviets. It's almost like they're tuning up for 1941. But why are the Soviets doing this? They want to learn German expertise with regards to war. Let's learn from German officers, the vaunted general staff. You know, and again, the Russians weren't stupid. You know, the Allies wanted the Germans to get rid of the general staff. They didn't really do much about that. And because the Germans are going to rename the general staff and they're going to call it the Troop Office. What an innocuous name that is. The Troop Office. Hitler's going to end this cooperation when he takes power. But it's back again. Because the Russians, you know, the Russians and the Germans, sure, we'll send you finished goods, and the Germans can send. The Russians are going to send raw materials. The Germans will send finished goods back to the Soviet Union. In particular, oil here. That's what the Germans want. By comparison, isn't Germany oil starved? You know, when Hitler invaded Poland, he only had 3 months oil. And so, but what's underneath here? Spheres of influence. Spheres of influence. Sure, the Germans will get the western half of Poland, the Soviets will get the eastern half. Germany's going to invade September 1st, 1939. The Soviets will begin to flood over the eastern border on September 17. But that's not the only part of this. Considered in the Stalin sphere of influence are 3 countries he wants: Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia. And northern Bukovina and Moldavia in Romania. That's what he wants. You know, Stalin at this point has sold out the West. So much for collective security, it didn't work. And Poles, the Poles are interesting. You know, the Churchill and Lloyd George tried telling the Poles, if we're gonna preserve Poland, you have to allow the Red Army onto your territory. No, not doing that. Not doing that. You know, the historical phobia, the nationalist phobia of the Russians predominates here. In fact, to save the Sudetenland, the British and the French, in particular the British, wanted the Poles to allow Russian troops to cross their territory to take part in saving Czechoslovakia. And what did the Poles say? No. In fact, keep in mind here, when Hitler finished carving up Czechoslovakia, he gave some territory to Poland and he gave some to Hungary. Wow. You can feel the love in the room here. Everyone loves everybody else. Again, this goes back to, I remember my father telling me as a kid, you know, he was really interested in history and politics. He said, friendship in the world, don't believe that. allies aren't friends. Allies are somebody, an association, or another nation you have something in common with. If being an ally was really heartfelt, remember the Grand Alliance in what we call World War II, Soviet Union, England, and the United States. What happened to that alliance as soon as Hitler put a bullet in his brain? That was the end of that. That glue that held that together dried up and flaked off. No more. We're done. Oh, you don't think Stalin doesn't understand this? You better believe he does. And so by the very beginning of October, there is no Poland. It's wiped off the map. And another experiment from Versailles. Poland no longer exists as an independent state. And so it seems at this point of this burgeoning war, which in essence Hitler has jump-started the European Civil War. That's essentially what he's done here. It seems at this point the Soviets and the Germans are allies at this point. Seems. And of course the British and the French are going to declare war on Nazi Germany. And were they able to help the Poles at all? No. 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 And so the sides seem to be chosen up here for the rest of the conflict at this point. But who can foresee down the road at this point? They can't. And so the Soviet Union is seen in the West again as a real bugaboo, as a real horrific power. And in 1940, when Hitler invades the West, he invades Denmark on April 9 and Norway, April 9, 1940. And then on May 10, 1940, he invades France and the Low Countries. Many thought Hitler would get stuck here, just like the Germans did in 1914. If not years, maybe months. Hitler said, the next war will not be fought like the last war. And France is knocked out in 6 weeks and the world is stunned. So the Russians. Because after the purge, when they divided up Poland, the Germans and the Russians, German officers meet Soviet officers. When they meet in Poland, Hitler gets these reports. These guys don't look that proficient. Hitler doesn't believe this. This is the Red Army. Largest army in the world? Can't be. Can't be. When the Soviets, after they took their end of Poland, November 30, 1939, the Winter War with the Finns, Stalin wants to push that border near Leningrad further north. And he wants territorial slices of Finland. He also wants the port of Hango. And the Finns say, no, I'm not going to do that. What do we want to do that for? We don't want to give you anything. Stalin sends 30 divisions against Finland. Finland has an army of 9 divisions. And they take it to the Soviets. That's when Hitler begins to believe, well, maybe what my officers were telling me a few weeks earlier in Poland, maybe it's true. Stalin's purges have decapitated the Soviet army. The Soviets will eventually bring great weight to bear, and by March 13, 1940, after about 3.5 months, the war is over. The Finns couldn't hold out. Yet, in that 3.5 months, it's going to cost the Soviets 50,000 dead and 150,000 wounded. 200,000 casualties against little Finland. Now Hitler's beginning to put it together here. But when he invades the West, beginning April 9, 1940, and then France and the Low Countries, May 10, 1940, Hitler was right. This war will not be fought like the last war. Trench warfare doesn't develop. France falls within 6 weeks. 6 weeks, the French are out. The world is stunned. Stalin, he's going to have to accelerate his rearmament program and training of the Red Army. But at the same time, while by the middle of June 1940, while the Germans are husbanding France, Stalin makes his move. He steamrollers Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and he takes northern Bukovina and Moldavia from the Romanians. That puts his tanks uncomfortably close to the largest repository of oil that Hitler can resort to, Ploesti in Romania. But there's nothing he can do about it at this point. And so, that being said, the Battle of Britain holds out. Hitler begins a big diplomatic blitz in the Balkans, trying to win over the Baltic states politically. Now again, like Mr. Putin today, not liking the idea that NATO is being spread into Eastern and Central Europe, Mr. Stalin didn't like the idea that Mr. Hitler was meddling in the Balkans. Aren't most of those people Slavs? Yeah, Slavs. And so it seems like Nazi-Soviet relations are beginning to come apart. Stalin says we need to understand what's going on here. And so Hitler invites Vyacheslav Molotov to Moscow in November of 1940 to clarify the situation. And so Molotov arrives. And Paul Schmidt, who was Hitler's interpreter, says Molotov was like my old school teacher. Very stern. Had the pince-nez glasses on his nose. Very stern, very uncompromising. Didn't spare Hitler an inch. And Paul Schmidt's rendition of this is fascinating. Hitler's interpreter. Molotov starts right off. This is November 13, 1940 at the Reich Chancellery in Berlin. In fact, Molotov was so distrustful of his hosts, every glass he was going to drink from, he had them boiled. And so he starts off, doesn't spare Hitler an inch. Is last year's agreement valid? Is our agreement valid? Is it valid? And Hitler, of course it's valid. Of course it's valid. Why wouldn't it be valid? And Molotov right back at him because of the Finns. You make friends with the Finns. You invite people from Finland to Germany, and people from Germany go to Finland. The Finns are dangerous people. They undermine our security, and we're going to have to do something about that. And he tells Hitler to his face, we are going to do something about that. Where Hitler explodes. I know what you want to do, Molotov, and I'm telling you it's out of the question. Do you understand that? Out of the question. This is going over well. Hitler's concerned. 45% of Nazi Germany's iron ore is coming from Sweden. Where is Finland located? Right next to Sweden. Stalin doesn't want to invade Sweden. The last thing he wants to do is upset Swedish neutrality here and push them to the west or Nazi Germany. But this is Hitler's fear. And so Paul Schmidt said this was an excellent rendition of heavyweight political discussion. The next day, the 14th, they're back at it in the evening. They're having a discussion. And then, one of the alarms goes off, the lights flicker. It's an air raid, the RAF. Now, this is not one of those 1,000 bomber raids. This is November 1940. The British can't do that. It's a pinprick raid, virtually what it is. They don't have the capacity for large-scale raids at this point, but it's still a raid. Hitler and Molotov are under this heavy oaken table. And Hitler has the temerity to say, the British are finished. And Molotov, again, he would have been great on Dean Martin's roasts. Comes right back. Well, if the British are finished, then why are we under this table and from whose bombs are we hiding from? Yet, while this has been going on, Hitler's already urged his generals to plan for the attack on the Soviet Union no later than May 15, 1941. And so it seems that the frail Nazi-Soviet relations and relationship are beginning to come apart. And so by 1941, this conflict was a European-style civil war, which started in 1914, Hitler having virtually won the war. How many times has Europe really been united in total here, or almost in total? Roman Empire? Napoleon? You can't count the Holy Roman Empire. That wasn't the whole of Western Europe. Roman Empire, Napoleon, Hitler, and now what? The EU? If you want to use that one. 4 times perhaps, 3 times by force of arms. And yet, when we come back next week, this whole thing is going to take a different course. This whole thing will take a different course. Interesting, at one point in the fall of 1940, the Japanese foreign minister was visiting fascist Italy, Nazi Germany, and then visited Moscow before going back to Tokyo. He offered to Hitler, we think we ought to admit the Soviet Union into the tripartite pact. In other words, it would have been fascist Italy, Nazi Germany, militarist Japan, and the Soviet Union. How would that have looked? How would that have been? And the Japanese even had spheres of influences. The Italians can have this, the Germans can have this, the Soviets can have this, we'll take this. Wow. What would that have done to the British and the United States? Chew on that one for a little while. Hitler says no. Well, there are a number of reasons for this. You know, this racial outlook towards subhuman Slavs. Of course, the other reason is Hitler's already ordered his generals to attack the Soviet Union, no later than May 15, 1941. Yet, the Soviet Union survives here so far. As far as the army goes, a new crop of general officers are coming up. People like Georgy Zhukov, one of the greatest generals of mass warfare to come out of the Second World War. He was out in Asia during the purges. Will defeat the Japanese in 1939 and begin to make a name for himself. He will be brought back west. Georgy Zhukov. Rokossovsky, as I mentioned before, will be rehabilitated. And other young generals will be coming up. Vasily Chuikov, Nikolai Vatutin, people you've probably never heard of, but are just as capable as any Patton or any Montgomery that we used during the war. One big difference to understand here, and as we get into this, I'll get into this next week, as competent as they were, it's as brutal as they were. You think Patton was tough? He was a choir boy. And I'll give you an inkling of this. Remember that movie Patton with George C. Scott? They went into the slapping incident on Sicily. There were actually 2 of those incidents, not 1. But they're not going to put 2 in the movie. And Patton had to go before every unit in his army and apologize per Eisenhower's orders. You know what else Eisenhower did? He sent a letter to George Marshall, Chief of Staff. And he intimated in this letter that Patton is not emotionally qualified to command the American armies going into France. He said at best he can be an army commander but not an overall commander. And you know what George Marshall did? Signed off on this and agreed. The other side of the coin here is, again, you know, he had to apologize for doing this. Let me tell you something. If that was Vasily Chuikov, who was the 62nd Army commander for the Soviets at Stalingrad. He would have taken his Radom pistol out of his holster, stuck it to that kid's temple, and blown his brains out. And that's our ally. Difference in cultures here. But I'll get into that more next week. And Stalin's leadership as a war leader. Right now at this stage, he virtually controls the Soviet Union. And by this point, by the time Hitler attacks the Soviet Union, this country, which in 1927 was for the most part a backward peasant economy, is at this point arguably the world's second-ranking industrial power. Did it cost a lot of lives? Yeah, of course it did, but this is Stalin. He doesn't care anyway. I want what I want, end of discussion. And I'll get into more of that next week, because part of that handout next week is going to have some production figures comparing the Soviets to the Germans with tank production. It'll make your eyeballs roll. It will. If you're used to this idea that we save the world. It's not quite that way. It was a collaborative effort, and you'll see that next week, between the United States and the Soviet Union. And I'll tell you right now, they won the land war. We did not. Did that help us do everything else? Yes. But I'll get into more details with that next week, and Stalin's part in this. Anybody have any questions or comments? Yes. Well, France, I mean, keep in mind the plight of France. You know, this war being so-called fought for, I'm talking about the 1914-18 conflict, this war being fought for democracy, no. It was fought for money, colony, politics, power. That's what it's fought for. And you see here, France, you know, it's going to cost the British 965,000 dead to keep her colonies. It's going to cost the French 1,565,000 dead to keep her colonies. Now, keep in mind, that's not the wounded yet. That's the dead. And France had access to 5.9 million men. Ouch! And so the idea here is, well, how do we fight against a country that has access to 9.7 million men? Well, you take from your colonies, Morocco, Senegal, Vietnam, and we'll take men and stick them in a French uniform and put them on the Western Front. That's what they're going to do. That made these host countries real happy. But the idea here is France was bled white in the trenches, and these people don't forget that. They never quite recovered from this. They never did. However, at the same time here, keep in mind, and the test comes in 1936. Remember Hitler, some of Hitler's generals, well, the French can mobilize 100 divisions. You know, and Hitler's army wasn't ready to fight the French army, at least on paper. And German generals understood this. That's what they understand. Hitler is willing to push that envelope. And he sends in 2 battalions. 2 battalions can't match up against 100 divisions, but the French don't mobilize. Part of that was, you're beginning to see the British and French beginning to do this. The British urged the French, don't mobilize. But at the same time, this is 1936. Is everybody out of the Depression yet? How's the French currency at this point? Not good. So if you want like Wall Street, and you want the British financial sector to invest in your currency, who's going to invest in your currency when you're mobilizing 100 divisions? Well, yeah, but we're digging out too. Well, yeah, because at this point, you can see where America's going, because, you know, the position of oil in 1938, when countries like Nazi Germany burned 46 million barrels of oil that year, the British burned 76 million barrels, the Soviets burned 183 million barrels, this country burned 1.2 billion barrels. And so you see us changing our economy and our industrial infrastructure, our transportation infrastructure, to accommodate this energy source known as oil. Well, the other side of the coin here is, no, they didn't. Because of the fact, you know, many of the French didn't want to go to war. And plus, there's the financial aspect, which I just alluded to. The other side of the coin here is, you know, in 1940, the French are still mired in what went on in 1914-18. And they were one of the pioneers of motorized transport. De Gaulle, a practitioner of the tank, he didn't get a proper airing. He was one of the real practitioners of armored warfare. And guess what? You know, some of this comes from understanding Mongol cavalry tactics. There were people like JFC Fuller and people like de Gaulle who understand, well, you know, the Mongols, the mobility of the Mongol cavalry. They destroyed opposing armies. Well, what's the new cavalry? The tank. Instead of one person on a horse, we got 4 or 5 in a tank. It's the same, virtually the same thing, mobility in war. And yet there were still many, you know, generals are reactionary too, like some of your fellow citizens or politicians. They don't like change. And so when people like JFC Fuller and people like de Gaulle and some other theorists put forth new ideas like this, what happens to them? They're not really listened. The Soviets understood this. Mikhail Tukhachevsky was one, but Stalin's going to have him shot. But later on in the war, even Stalin's going to learn. And I'll go into that next week. But the French were stymied here by politics, economics. And what happened in the First World War? They were bled white. They were bled white. It's hard to get people to fight when they're bled white. And then on top of that, do they really trust their leaders? Didn't 54 divisions of French troops revolt in 1917? Yes. Divisions, not platoons, companies, or battalions. Divisions. Multiply that by 13, 14, 15,000 men a division. Ouch. That's a lot. Revolt. Picture yourself in those trenches, folks, and nobody's going anywhere, and constantly people are being killed. Not hard to figure that one out. Yes? They all go back to the same. Well, I used the word shot because that was the standard procedure inside the Soviet Union. Many times it was behind the neck and that was it. In fact, I think it was in now that you brought that up, in Lubyanka Square, the NKVD headquarters, they even had in one room where they were killing these people, the cement floor was angled so the blood would run down the floor. Yeah, oh yeah, hey, you know, talk about German efficiency. You know, and so, yeah. So there's really no, of course, I use the term with Trotsky, murdered. He wasn't really executed inside the Soviet Union. Yeah, that's right, 1940. So, yes? Well, you know, Stalin didn't trust his own mother. And so, of course, the night this is signed in Moscow, it was signed like 2:30 in the morning. And von Ribbentrop and Molotov, and Stalin raises a toast. And he says to Adolf Hitler, what a fine fellow. Yeah, don't think he trusted him. Don't think he trusted him. No, he didn't. What a fine fellow. Again, you can feel the love in the room here. And yet, what's happening here? They're setting the stage for the greatest land war in modern times. Because if you read Mein Kampf, the reason for the war is the East. I mean, what did the Germans get when they conquered France and the Low Countries? Some trees, some people, and some wine? Big deal. You invade the Soviet Union, what are you getting? Oil, coal. Of course, Germans have coal, access to coal, but still more coal. Tungsten, uranium, well, uranium with the atomic bomb program, manganese, so on and so forth. And food, that's it. The breadbasket, Ukraine. Again, Ukraine's going to be a battlefield here. Today, Ukraine is the world's 5th largest producer of wheat. And you wonder why Russia and the United States want it? It should be hard to figure that one out. Archer, Midland, Daniels would like nothing better than that Monsanto take control of Ukrainian agrarian potential. That's what's going on here anyway. But again, at this point, you see what they're getting ready for 1941. And when we come back here next week, you're going to get an earful of that one. It's not a pretty picture. But then again, is war a pretty picture? No, not really. Ask some guys that were in it. They'll tell you. Yes? If the Germans had fought it right, they could have defeated the Soviets, but it wasn't. It wasn't. I'll get into that next week. I don't want to ruin the script for next week, but that's a great question. That's a great question, but I'm going to answer that next week. Yeah, Stalin didn't believe some of his spies, and I'll get into that next week too. But he will eventually believe Richard Sorge, and I'll get into who he is. Yeah, Stalin was the type he didn't trust anybody. I don't even know if he trusted the man in the mirror. He was very distrustful, very wedded to power. If anyone, I guess, is the quintessential or poster child expression of totalitarianism, it's Joe Stalin. That would be an interesting talk too. The difference between authoritarianism and totalitarianism. There is a difference. Some have said that maybe Mussolini was not a totalitarian; he was an authoritarian. I'll give you that; he was. But Stalin was a totalitarian. And so, having said that, that helps to explain some of Stalin's actions here. But does it cost the Soviets, especially in the beginning of the war? Yes. And so, yeah, but I'll get into that more next week. But yeah, that's right. He didn't believe many of his spies. But then again, the Soviets, for all intents and purposes, were more efficient at that than the Germans were. And I'll get into that next week too, especially when you get to the Battle of Kursk, the greatest air-land battle in history. That was the battle that's going to decide the land war for the rest of the Second World War in 1943. So yes. Well, but in that area, it is a breadbasket. And that's why the Germans wanted it in World War I, and that's why Hitler wanted it by 1942.